Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the sixth part of our 9-part series on emergency planning. Today's session will focus on succession planning. My name is Mike Bittner. I'm a quality improvement advisor with Superior Health. I'll be facilitating today's call along with my Superior Health colleague, Tony Kettner. Tony will be dropping the slides into the chat throughout the presentation and also dropping the survey questions. Before I introduce our speakers for today's call, I want to take this time to review a few housekeeping items. We'll post the slide deck several times in the chat box for your convenience. Please feel free to add questions or comments into the chat box as you think of them. We'll answer questions at the end of the call. There will also be an opportunity to ask a live question at the end of the call, and we'll review the process a bit later. The series is being recorded and will be available on the Superior Health YouTube channel in about 2 weeks. This will allow you and your team to access the recordings on demand when it's convenient for you. We'll post an evaluation link at the end of today's call. We'd appreciate it if you would take a few minutes and complete that for us. We use the evaluations to improve calls and determine if there are any other topics you may find informational or helpful. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Brian Kaczmarski and Amy Woolman-Nesseth. Welcome, Amy and Brian.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you to those of you who are joining us today. It was nice to present last week with Tony at the WHCA conference and to meet Mike and Tony in person. So again, thank you for the invitation to do that with you last week. That was a lot of fun. So today we are going to be looking at succession planning. And again, I want to keep the focus on how is succession planning connected to emergency preparedness, because that is really the focus of our 9-part series here. So we're gonna think about it in that framework or with that lens today. So understanding the importance of succession planning, particularly as it relates to emergency preparedness, understand why we need to do succession planning, introduce a process for succession planning, and there are many out there, but there are some basic themes that we want to pull forward, and then demonstrate the cost of not doing succession planning. So again, as I said, this image before you is the emergency preparedness cycle, and by now that should be pretty familiar to all of you. The reason that we're talking about succession planning today is because emergency planning is all about reducing risk, right? And making sure that we can continue to provide the kind of quality care, safety that our patients deserve. We know when there's frequent transitions in leadership or frequent transitions in our staffing overall, that can lead to inefficiencies, inconsistencies. There can be a loss of focus on what our organizational priorities are, and there can be failures in terms of missing some of the core values or missing some of the direction that may have been the focus of a previous leader. So when we do succession planning, and when we talk about succession planning, we're going to define that a little bit later in this presentation. But when we talk about how do we groom, how do we identify, how do we find people within our current organizational structure that can potentially move into leadership positions when there is an emergency, we know that if we have thought through that process early before the emergency, that can help us mitigate some of those risks. And again, that's what we are all about in emergency preparedness. And if we mitigate that risk, then we minimize those gaps. We provide a strong, stable environment and leadership for the skills and the expertise that we need in order to be successful. We're able to maintain our critical functions. And as we're going to see in just a minute, we can remain compliant with all of the expectations of our surveyors and of our accrediting agencies. Again, to tie in some of our previous presentations, the culture of emergency preparedness really is what this is all about. And one of the questions that I would ask you is the culture in your organization tied up with the leadership personality? And let me give you some examples of that. I think we can all think of politicians or faith leaders or corporate leaders or even educational leaders, where those leaders are so charismatic and are able to attract people to their way of thinking, their ideology, their way of practice because of their personality. That when that leader leaves, sometimes their organizations are driftless, right? They don't have a focus because the culture of that personality was not deeply embedded into the organization as a whole. So if we want to embed that culture of emergency preparedness, we need to make sure that that culture has filtrated down to every level, every person within that organization, and not be just tied to the leader. The culture that we're seeking is that culture of quality care for our patients, of safety, and that dedication to quality improvement, are always trying to get better. And we know that when we lose our leadership, sometimes again, we can lose our direction and our focus sometimes, and therefore, we can be adrift. But we also know that transition is also a time when we can sit down and reevaluate what our priorities are, what our goals are in terms of what that new leader will bring to the organization. We know that the culture of work has changed, particularly over these last few years because of COVID. We know that there's an increase in online commerce and on online virtual or remote work. There's a desire among the people who are employed in our organizations for more flexibility, to find meaning and purpose in the work that they do, and recognition within that work environment. And then we know that many, many people have competing opportunities, especially in the kind of work that we do in long-term care. When a CNA can get a job that pays more down the road at a fast food joint, they are less likely to want to work within long-term care. And that creates a lot of problems for us. And when we talk about recruitment and retention of our staff. So why do we have to do succession planning? Why is it a good idea? Number one reason, of course, is it's a requirement. It comes from Appendix Z from the CMS Emergency Preparedness ruling. And it very clearly says in tag number 7 that the emergency plan must identify which staff would assume specific roles in the absence of that leadership through succession planning and delegations of authority. And again, it defines that succession planning. It's how do we identify and develop people who are already within our organization, who already understand our culture of preparedness and safety and quality, to fill those key positions if and when there is an absence. The reason this is in the emergency preparedness ruling is because particularly during COVID, there were situations where leaders were not clearly identified. And if the administrator of a particular facility became ill for a prolonged period of time or died because of the pandemic, there were situations where there was no written delegation of authority, and therefore it became a risk for that organization, and quality and safety potentially were compromised. So this has been added to Appendix C and to the expectations. So what does that mean? At a minimum, you have to have in writing, in a policy, who is authorized to act in the absence of the administrator, or who is legally responsible for the operations of the facility. And again, we always talk about 3 deep. It makes sense if you can identify at least 3 people or 3 job titles that will be able to have that delegation of authority. And again, why? Because we want to ensure continuity of operations, ensure the facility has plans in place to continue functioning even during an emergency, and to provide care in a safe setting. Another example that I will give, which again is a very scary example, but it is something that has happened, I was at a presentation that was talking about, I believe it was a clinic setting where the administrator's office was right inside the front door. And they had an active shooter incident where that active shooter came into that facility, and the very first person that they killed was the administrator. Well, that facility did not have strong plans in place for continuity of operations. And that caused all sorts of operational issues as well as legal issues as they started to work through that recovery process. Again, that's not something any of us ever want to think about, but today it is something we have to think about. The other issue is, why is this important? Because we know that we are facing, if we are not already facing, a very serious staffing crisis. And let me give you some examples. There are a few words that should stand out to you here. One of them is the silver tsunami, and the other is the great resignation. So the great resignation, of course, was that trend that we have seen across the country and probably worldwide of people reevaluating their priorities, choosing to leave their current place of employment to find more meaningful employment for them, or something that fits that flexibility that they're seeking with this change in our work environment. The other one is the silver tsunami, and that's talking about what we know is coming by the time of 2034, where there will be 77 million people over the age of 65, compared to significantly fewer under the age of 18. So what that means is we're going to have many more larger number of older adults who are going to need more of the kind of care that you provide, and including people who have much more significant chronic diseases and comorbidities, because as we live longer, we develop more and more of those. The other thing to be aware of is how we have lost significant members of the workforce. I want to go back one slide and talk about the WHA 2022 report that is linked here. And it talks about the kind of healthcare positions that we are running into severe shortages. And some of those, this will be no surprise to you, are certified nursing assistants, surge techs, respiratory therapists, and licensed practical nurses. And that was in 2021. We know that that has probably only gotten worse as we moved further through the pandemic. And there's similar data coming from Minnesota as well as from Michigan. We know, particularly in our rural areas, that we are losing healthcare providers, and shockingly, among them are physicians. And then in Michigan, we know that many healthcare facilities are looking at vacancy rates that have approached 20% or more. And that's significant for each and every one of us. So just more data that should raise the alarms here is that employment of registered nurses is projected to grow 6% in the next 10 years up until 2031. But we know that the feeder system, or the rate at which we are training new nurses, is significantly less. So 203,200 openings for registered nurses are projected each year on average over the decade. And again, many of those openings are happening because people who are existing, who currently exist in our healthcare system, are choosing to leave because of the many, many challenges that healthcare is facing. So the feeder system, let's talk about our nursing schools. And again, I know this is a generality to nursing and not to other occupations, but it does, I think, reflect what's happening in healthcare overall. Right now, we're going to need 6% increase in the next 10 years. Right now, we're only graduating, 3.3% increased numbers. So that's not matching what the need is going to be. And we know that we are turning away applications. And there are reasons why we're doing that. And it has to do with the fact that we don't have enough nursing faculty We don't have enough clinical sites to get our nurses trained. We don't have enough money to open new nursing schools, nor do we have enough classroom space. And so even if there are students who are interested in going into this field, which we desperately need, we don't have the infrastructure in place in order to move them through that process quickly enough. And that becomes another significant problem. Finally, just one more data point. The cost of turnover for one nurse has increased 15%. So when you think about the training costs, the investment that we make in each of our nurses, just as an example, or any of our employees, we can see that there is data that shows that that increase has risen dramatically quicker than other types of hospital turnover. So nurses, you know, if you ever wanted to be a nurse, now's the time, right? And thank goodness my stepdaughter is going to nursing school. But even in her experience, and she's not even out of school yet, she talks about, oh, I'm only going to do clinical work for maybe 5 years, and then I'm going to go do something different. And part of that's a reflection on the culture. And so not only does this become a challenge of succession planning, but it becomes a challenge of retention. So how do we mitigate this problem? Okay, we know that we have a significant issue that we are experiencing now, but that we will be experiencing in the future. There are kind of two ways to look at this. Number one, most of us are in that place where we're just trying to do replacement hiring, right? As we have staff turnover, we are doing the best we can to just fill those positions, put bodies in those positions so that we can continue to operate. In my mind, that is a crisis response, right? That is reactive. And as Brian often says, we are catching up to the emergency. We're playing catch up. Where we want to be is that ideal state of succession planning, where we have the ability to put some time and some effort into planning for these absences, being proactive in managing those transitions. We know that that's not always easy, and we're going to talk a little bit about some strategies that will help us get to that place.
All right, thank you, Amy, for setting the stage for me here. I'm going to jump into a little bit more formal definition around succession planning, and then we'll get into some examples. But what you're seeing on your screen, the key words here: deliberate, systematic, and it's really to ensure leadership continuity in key positions. And that doesn't just mean administrative leadership. Think of the different units and functions and teams that are within your facility. There's leadership within those units as well. So don't just think at the very top of the organizational structure. Yes, we are including that, but there are other places where leadership is definitely needed, and there will be opportunities for succession planning in those areas. What we really need to focus on is those planned departures. So hopefully you have some pre-notice of an impending retirement. That would be an example of that. You also have unplanned departures. For life reasons, people need to quit on short notice. Somebody may have gotten a job opportunity of a lifetime. It may be disciplinary in related. And that can be, you may or may not have notice of that. It may be something that happens relatively quickly. So identifying those key positions in advance gives you an opportunity to go, uh-oh, we think we're going to have a absence or a resignation in this position. And this was one of the key positions that we identified in our succession plan. So we needed to pay special attention to replacing this position. And again, think of it in terms of those that have the most impact on your daily operations. Again, everybody has to have an administrator, but think about those key staff members that if they weren't there, daily operations would struggle. To me, those are people that you need to identify in your succession planning as well. Next slide, Amy. So again, it's not so much we have to do succession planning, but we get to do succession planning. Believe me, when I first started out as a health officer, I thought a lot of these plans were a waste of time because you have to take time to go ahead and think proactively about how you're going to do this in the future. And again, we were in a state in the world of healthcare where we were just reacting. We were just barely keeping our heads above water. So some of the things that you want to think about is talent retention. Of the staff that we currently have, we know that there's been this mass exodus, but of the staff that we currently have, where are our future superstars? People that we can potentially groom for future positions. That helps to promote continuity. It also maintains a leadership pipeline. Another thing it does is it really helps with retention. The reason for that is if staff see that there are vertical opportunities for advancement within your agency, they are more likely to stick with your agency. In terms of improving financial performance, Amy mentioned the slide of how much it costs to replace a staff member. What that didn't take into effect are the inefficiencies and the loss of production from a new staff member as compared to that outgoing seasoned staff member. They're simply not going to output as efficiently as that more seasoned staff member. And you can put a dollar value to that. It does cost reduction in training time. It does help improve retention, which again, to me, is part of the staffing crisis in our nation. Yes, we've lost a lot of people, but we need to really focus on those that are still there. It helps to increase employee engagement. The generations today, number one, want to feel that they are part of valued work, that they are going to a place where they can make a difference. This allows them to be a part of that process and feel like they're a part of something that is bigger than themselves. And then it helps to strengthen overall quality. If I can bring somebody up from the front line into mid-management and into leadership positions, there's that institutional knowledge that goes with them. Okay. And that saves countless hours in training, education, mentoring, and shadowing. Internal versus external hires. Some of the advantages of going with internal staff that you currently have. Overall, it's less costly because they know the ins and outs of the agency or institution. They tend to be more productive, especially early, than external hires, because those external hires are going to have that onboarding period, that period of time where they simply need to get to know things like where are the restrooms, where are the fire extinguishers, all of those basics that go along with a new hire. Advancement promotes retention. We talked about that. It establishes organizational relationships, and it reduces that overall training time. Now, there are times when it's not feasible. We recognize that. So there are times when external hires are necessary. Some of the advantages that they bring in, they may have new ideas. They may look at things from a different perspective because they're a fresh set of eyes that are coming into your agency. It's an opportunity to diversify your staff. We know justice, equity, diversion, and inclusiveness are all key words today in the workforce, and this provides us an opportunity to be able to do that. You can form new relationships without the bias of the past. Let's say that there were time periods within your agency that were difficult, that were challenging. That may skew an internal hire's view of the agency, and that may be reflective in their leadership as they get promoted. The benefit of having somebody from the outside come in is they don't have that background knowledge, and they're not going to operate in terms of, well, this is what happened in the past. And then it helps to identify and strengthen some of those internal relationships. From a framework perspective, all succession plans we recommend have something similar to what you're seeing on the screen. Identify those critical positions, identify the competencies that are needed for those critical positions. Where should you find them? You should find them in the position descriptions. They should be identified there. If they aren't identified there, you need to update your position descriptions. Look to develop that leadership pipeline. There's a golden rule out there, 70-30. 70% of advancements should come from inside, 30% it's recommended are external. Have a succession plan that identifies and implements strategies to ensure continuity and smooth transfer of knowledge. That's hard part. I can remember being a health officer and I had a retirement of a public health nurse that had been there for 41 years. That is some comprehensive institutional knowledge that was walking out that door. And we made sure that we could do everything that we could to try to glean out of that person's brain the institutional knowledge that they had. And there's some strategies for that we're going to talk about. And then, just like we do with all things preparedness, QI it. This is all about a QI process as well. Adjust, modify, dial it in, tweak it. It's always going to be a work in progress. Amy did a really good job of saying we want to tie succession planning back to emergency preparedness. One of the analogies that I use is, remember when we talked about HVAs or hazard vulnerability assessments? It's sort of a tool that allows you to identify the top threats to your facility. Proper succession planning is the equivalent of an HVA to your workforce. So if you think about it from that perspective, you're preempting potential issues that are most likely to happen to your workforce. Next slide. This is just an example of one tool that you could use to help identify not only key positions, but key upcoming talent that you may or may not have observed, whether that be frontline staff or people that are working their way up the food chain. You can see that performance is identified on the x-axis and potential is identified on the y-axis. And you can see that based on where you are, you could have a potential gem in the upper left-hand corner. You could have a star achiever in the upper right-hand corner. You could have a solid performer in the lower right-hand corner. So again, looking at things from the perspective of performance and potential can help you identify not only those key positions, but those people that could potentially slide into those positions and be set up for success. Next slide. Some other ideas that we want to share with you. Job rotation and cross training. Okay, that's not shadowing. When I think of job shadowing, it's today you're going to go follow this person and see what it is they do on a daily basis. That is very passive. It ends up being, I, as a new employee, am going to sit there and watch that person do their job. Sure, there's communication and conversation and things like that, but it's very passive. Rotation and cross training is very active. You are not only going to shadow that individual, you're going to jump in, you're going to get your hands dirty, and you're going to carry out some of the functions of that person that you're with. We know that this is a slow process. It requires personnel, time, and cost. But what it does is it develops that on-the-job skills and experience and the ability to cross-transfer, if necessary, provide surge support to whatever that position is. The example that I like to use for that one in a public health department is when COVID hit, everybody learned to become a contact tracer. Everybody learned to become a disease investigator. That's not a day-to-day job for an environmental health staff, but guess what? They learned it because they needed to, out of necessity. So instead of using the terminology of shadowing, which again is very common terminology, think about cultivating, incentivizing. Shadowing's still important, but precepting, I mean, actually sort of the mentor-mentee concept, which gets me to the other side, mentoring and coaching, an effective way to encourage and counsel. Again, we know it's time consuming, but we believe that that time commitment up front is going to save you on the back end because you're going to have less of a period of time of onboarding. It's a very effective retention tool, and it provides employees with an individualized plan. So a lot of you may have an onboarding or an orientation plan. I would encourage you to take a close look at it and see where you're identifying job shadowing opportunities and strengthen those areas of your onboarding plan. And there can be ways to add incentives like tuition reimbursement and ongoing continuing education. If I'm in position X, but I've been mentoring and cross-training with somebody in position Y, maybe I can get continuing education that would potentially make it easier for me to slide into that position in the future. Next slide. So an example of when turnover is known. Okay, again, that's an ideal state when there's going to be staff turnover. The recommendation is to actually recruit to allow for a 3 to 6 month period for cross training. So again, think about this right now. The outgoing staff member is still on the payroll. And the person that's going to replace them, they're on the payroll too at the same time. Now, the first thing an administrator is probably going to think is, I can't do that. I can't afford that. Essentially, I'm paying 2 people to do 1 job. That's true. You are. But think about what you're getting by doing that. You're getting 3 to 6 months of one-on-one instruction, transfer of institutional knowledge, and an understanding of how things operate by a very seasoned staff member. One of the things that I learned to do with my outgoing staff is I actually assigned them to rewrite their position description before they left the agency. Because if you really think about it, especially somebody that's been there 25, 30 years, that position description is grossly outdated. And most position descriptions, within 2 to 3 months of that person being hired, that position description has likely changed. And why has it changed? Because that unique person has put their footprint on that job, and they have likely built in nuances that reflect their skill set and the things that they're interested in. So I always have my outgoing staff rewrite their position description. And the first thing they'll say is, well, this isn't even close to what I do now on a day-to-day basis. And I say, yep, tear it up, rip it apart, and write it to accurately reflect what you're doing right now. Number 1, it helps to keep position descriptions current. Number 2, it's a truer reflection of what that position is. The other thing that I like to encourage outgoing staff to do is it's sort of write a letter to yourself. You know, you write it in 3rd grade and you read it as a senior, that sort of thing. But the top 5 things I wish I knew about this job in order to be successful when I first started. And you're going to hand that off to that person that's going to be your replacement. There can be times in succession planning and changing workforce where there can be jealousy. There can be a feeling of, I'm not needed anymore, and this new person is going to come in and take my job. By empowering your staff to be the one that is responsible or partly responsible for ensuring that that new person is going to be successful and making them part of the process, it eliminates those feelings. And it gives that outgoing person an opportunity to say, hey, I just put the best 40 years of my life into this job. I want this place to stay successful, and I want my replacement to be successful. And I actually have an opportunity to do that. And again, it helps to retain that institutional knowledge. One of the things, again, not only rewriting position description, but the different programs and functions and jobs that that incoming staff member is doing, that outgoing staff member can create simple things, again, like checklists, process flow maps that are going to help that new staff member be successful. And again, when it's all said and done, this is a quality improvement process. Next slide. So why doesn't succession planning happen? I think we can all think of some very obvious and common reasons based on the last 2 or 3 years of the world of healthcare. But very often, I think we have the mindset, this is not just healthcare, but I think it's business in general, our world in general. It's that hoping for the best, thinking this is never going to happen to us sort of thing. We're not taking that planning too seriously. There are always other priorities or other plans that are most important. So again, it's that reactive piece versus proactive. Lack of tools or a formal process. When Amy and I started to go down this road, we were like, doing lit reviews, there's not a lot out there on succession planning. There are a lot of written narratives on succession planning, but there aren't a lot of very practical, useful tools that you could grab and use right now. Failure to implement the plan. I can't tell you how many times I requested to recruit for a new hire so that there would be crossover from the time of the retirement to the time that that person onboarded. And the answer is usually no. And they will cite fiscal reasons for that. And that's where you need to get in the mindset of trying to educate and have a sales pitch of saying, whatever we're incurring upfront as a cost, we're going to save 2 to 3-fold on the back end. And that's the mindset that you want to take in with your administration. And then again, a lot of agencies are set up so that there aren't opportunities for, quote, climbing the ladder. And that is conducive to an environment that's not going to be very receptive to succession planning. Next slide. So again, we know right now, many of us don't have the luxury of sitting down and writing a succession plan because we're all short-staffed. I mean, who are you going to pull from the floor to sit down and help write that succession plan? So what can we do in a not ideal environment? Well, one of the things we can do is we can hire with an eye for advancement. Think about the skill sets you need. One of the terms that I've heard a lot in leadership management and recruitment is hire for a fit, train them to do the skills. Hire for somebody that's going to be a good fit for your team. Training somebody to do a skill, policy, procedure, or a protocol, that's the easy part. You want to look for those intangibles, those inner values and core beliefs. Emphasize your marketing and recruitment. Strive to keep the people that you have. Again, we know we've lost upwards of 40% of our healthcare staff. We got to hang on to that 60% as hard as we possibly can. Identify those people with potential and invest in them. Let them know that you see them. You see the potential talent that they have. And it doesn't hurt to stop in every now and then and say, hey, where do you see yourself in 2 years in this agency? Or have you ever thought about this program or this position? Acknowledge those motivated employees by providing clear opportunities for advancement or education. And then this last one can really be a double-edged sword, depending on how you approach it. Reward those employees with more responsibility. Now, I know that there have been staff in my agencies that actually look at that as a negative. And the mindset that they have is, well, that person clearly is a favorite, or if I work really hard and I'm really efficient, I'm just going to get loaded on with a whole bunch more work. So why would I want to do that to myself? That's an opportunity for you to spin that with your staff and say, hey, If you see people that are being given extra assignments and responsibilities, that's not punitive. That is proactive, and it's actually a reward because leadership and management see the potential in that particular individual. So use that as an opportunity. Next slide. Another area that we focus on in succession planning is transformational leadership. And this is that whole mindset about leader versus manager. Focus on and care for your people. Remain open to new ideas, be accessible and visible. Okay. It's not the mindset of what can my staff do for me? It's the mindset of what can I do to make my staff successful? Because I can't do it without my staff. It's not possible. Which lends itself well, again, we've mentioned this earlier, that leader in every chair concept. Let staff brainstorm, let them create, let them think. They know the areas of their job where there are inefficiencies. And why do I know that? Because all you need to do is walk up to an employee and say, what is the part of your day that frustrates you the most? What about your job drives you crazy? And they're going to tell you. They're going to know exactly what it is. And my suggestion is when they shoot that right back at you, say, you know what? I agree with you. Go QI that thing. Go work through that thing and try to make it something that all of a sudden is no longer the most frustrating part of your day. You've acknowledged that they have an issue. You've recognized that they have an issue, and now you're empowering them to go out and take care of the issue. And it doesn't turn into an administrator saying, well, you just need to do this, because that's not effective for anybody. It's that whole concept of work smarter, not harder. And really what it boils down to is the concept of trial and error, which is a simplistic form of quality improvement. Next slide, please. Here are some very practical tools. I mentioned that as Amy and I were doing some reviews, again, lots of white papers and very long narrative reports on the concept of succession planning. Here are some ones that, number one, reinforce the reason that we chose this as a topic, and then also some very practical tools. The very first one from NALBO, and the second one, the workforce and succession planning, those have some very simple practical tools in them, as well as the second to last one, the succession planning tools and templates. We think you'll find some very good ideas in there that you could either take and use as is, adopt and implement them right away, or you could tweak them to meet the needs of your agency. The next couple of slides are simply references, and I will conclude before I turn it back over to Amy for final comments, and then or Superior Health with, again, you've all identified and have probably a lead emergency response person within your agency. Amy and I would encourage you to consider COOP and succession planning because they are pretty related to each other. Consider those as part of your emergency response plans, because from a succession planning standpoint, what you're really doing is you're trying to avert or avoid or mitigate potential emergency with a sudden staff replacement or an anticipated staff replacement. Amy, I'll turn it back over to you, and then back to our Superior Health partners.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Again, this is a topic I think that we don't always put within the framework of emergency preparedness, but I hope this conversation today did help you kind of reframe and think of it as a way of preventing or mitigating those risks that we do have in our organizations. So we're always available for questions, either live now or by email. Please feel free to reach out to us at any time. And I will turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Amy. All right, it doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat. If anyone would like to take this opportunity to ask any live questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in.
So while folks are maybe thinking about or making comments, we are still reviewing nursing homes, public health emergency preparedness plans. So if you would like us to do that for you, it's at no cost to you. You get a really lovely summary back that, as we've mentioned previously, you could use for quality improvement activities within your organization, because I think we all know that emergency preparedness planning is part of the quality improvement process. And then I just wanted to mention a couple of upcoming opportunities that we want you to just kind of just be aware of and stay tuned for some details, probably starting maybe in June. But because of the success of this series, we've invited Amy and Brian back through the month of August, from August 3rd to the 24th, to conduct some weekly meeting opportunities for Superior Health with respect to creating, writing, developing a tabletop exercise. We recognize that that might be something that you would like additional information about, and that would be helpful to you within the whole context of emergency preparedness planning. So we're very excited about that. And then we're also very excited about this second opportunity, but that will be actually facilitating, Amy and Brian will be facilitating some actual virtual tabletop exercises that meet all of the requirements under Appendix Z. And we'll be hosting quite a number of those events starting in September of this year through September of next year. So we're excited to be able to offer that opportunity. You'll get information back that will be helpful to you again in your quality improvement activities around emergency preparedness. So again, more details should be coming hopefully by end of May, June-ish. So stay tuned for both of those events. We're very excited to be offering both.
All right, thank you, Tony. Brian's right, it is must-see TV. Also, we have a comment on the chat, Amy and Brian, if you have any follow-up feedback, I'll just go ahead and read this. Succession planning should include spending amounts. If the CEO has top dollar spending and is now out and a lower level leader is in place, do they have the same spending power? If you guys have any thoughts on that.
I guess the first thing I would want is to clarify the question. So I look at that one of two ways. Does that person have the same salary? Likely not, depending on qualifications, which then opens up funding for other opportunities. Or is Mark referring to actual spending power of what they're allowed to spend within their budget without getting approval from somebody above them? So if we could get clarification on that, I think it would help us to better answer.
Yeah, Brian. So this was an actual question that I had from a surveyor. And they said, if your CEO if there's an event going on and you need to purchase a service or a part, and the CEO is now out, does the next person filling those shoes, even if they had a lesser spending amount in their previous role, now have that same spending power?
Typical best practice, and the example I'm going to use is out of emergency management. Most times for a local jurisdiction in emergency response, they'll generally set a spending limit of $5,000. And what that means is that emergency manager, any expense that would be necessary related to whatever that response is, they have free reign to spend anything that doesn't cross that $5,000 threshold. Anything above that, they would need to then go to their county board or immediate supervisor, that type of thing. So I would parlay that into your scenario of you've got that person that's been there for a long period of time who has some experience in response, and they have an X dollar threshold for a response. That new person coming in, I would probably just from a liability and a safety standpoint, maybe even an experience standpoint, I would probably rewrite their position description to a lower threshold, at least until they've been in a position where, I don't want to say you trust them, but they've established that they have an understanding of how that process works. And then by setting that lower, it's just another check and balance for that individual, be able to go up to the person above them, or again, their board or their medical advisor. So you get that shared decision making versus solo decision making, especially when it comes to finance. I think when we can make shared financial decisions, it spreads the liability and potential scrutiny on more people than just one.
Yeah, the surveyor, I agree with you, Brian, 100%. But the surveyor wanted to see that right in the succession planning. And so it wasn't necessarily a dollar amount, they called it a tier level spending. And so tier 1 was, 100,000 to 250,000. Tier 2 was below that, and tier 3, so you didn't have to put it right in the succession planning, but the tier levels they wanted in there, they wanted to see all of that information.
Yeah. And I would argue that that was probably part of the, I mean, how it is with all of our surveyors, it depends on that person's background and their experience and the things that they've been tripped up on before, right? As to what kinds of questions they're going to ask. But again, no matter what your answer was, I'm confident they wanted to see it written in a policy. And I can't emphasize that enough, is again, that whole concept of documentation. And again, my guess is, Mark, if you didn't have it in your succession plan, you do now, or you're going to, because the question was asked. And so again, so important to have these kind of shared experiences available for conversation, because that you just saved somebody from having to get tripped up on that question down the road. So have it in writing. Think through, again, if you don't have it in writing yet, what is your corrective action going to be to get it in writing?
Mark, can I ask a quick follow-up question to that? If you added that language into your plan, or I know kind of how you roll, Mark, you probably already had it in there. Did it end up in a succession plan, or did it end up in a job action sheet of an incident commander? Where did that language actually sit?
In the succession plan.
Okay, thank you.
And we did it for the hospital, and then the whole organization did it from the very top all the way down. They said it after we had done it in our plan after the survey.
It's a great idea. And again, one of the things that Amy and I see often in response is that finance and admin piece of the incident command system is usually an afterthought, and it's almost always activated later than it should have been.
Okay, any other questions? Doesn't look like it. All right, Mark, thank you very much for that. Thank you, Brian and Amy, for sharing this great information that'll help us all prepare for emergencies in our organization. Thanks for everybody for attending today. The next webinar will be held on May 4th. The topic will be building a resilient team. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a good day.